Mason Ridley wasn't a recluse. He didn't hate people. He simply didn't trust them with anything rooted in the ground. When he inherited the property from his uncle 4 years ago, he had no grand plans to reshape the land. The house, modest but solidly built, sat near the back of a long plot in a semi-rural community just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. The surrounding development was what you might call aggressively curated. Gated blocks of carefully uniform houses painted in shades of taupe, with grass trimmed by schedule. Not nature. But Mason's lot was older, grandfathered into the area before such communities acquired names, bylaws, and mission statements. His land was deeper than most, and the property line included a stretch of low orchard his uncle had planted by hand over the course of 2 decades. The trees were arranged in concentric arcs, each row slightly taller than the last, like an inverted amphitheater of fruit and foliage. It wasn't a commercial operation. No one harvested systematically. Mason didn't even eat the fruit most of the time. That wasn't the point. The orchard was an intentional act, an organic architecture that made no profit, asked no favors, and existed without compromise. The soil had been layered with compost and mulch so many times that walking barefoot across it felt like stepping into memory. The air in the orchard always seemed a little cooler than the rest of the property, and the noise of the world, leaf blowers, delivery vans, kids arguing over Wi-Fi, somehow never reached its center. Mason kept the orchard meticulously, not out of sentiment, but out of a kind of private discipline. He had spent most of his career as a freelance landscape consultant, the kind of person wealthy developers paid too much money to walk around their grounds and tell them where the shade should fall. Over time, the work numbed him. Too many clients wanted engineered serenity, not honest land. He stopped taking new projects 3 years ago and shifted to advisory roles for parks and older properties. Anything that didn't involve bulldozing a hillside to install koi ponds and zen rock gardens. By the time spring rolled around this year, Mason had fallen into a rhythm. He'd get up early, do his pruning and watering before the sun got high, and spend afternoons reading or mapping long-term growth strategies for other neglected orchards across the state. He didn't attend community meetings. He didn't object to the manicured uniformity around him. He just didn't acknowledge it. The property management notices were received, read, and responded to with cold formality, always through certified mail, always in legal language, always with proof of delivery. If they wanted to issue a guideline on fence height or mailbox color, fine. But he had carved out one strip of land they couldn't make symmetrical. One pocket of deliberate, slow, untidy beauty. And that, he later concluded, was precisely why they came for it. It started with a slight shift in tone in the letters he received from the property board. The language became less informative and more assumptive, as if decisions had already been made, and they were merely extending him the courtesy of being notified. There was a preliminary community access revision plan that made vague reference to open zones of mutual benefit and an equity-based reassessment of lot divisions. Mason responded, as always, through formal channels, requesting clarification and citing easement law. No reply came. Then, 3 weeks into his short trip upstate to visit a friend and review an heirloom estate in Bluffton, he received a text from his part-time groundskeeper, an older man named Curtis who came by once a week to check irrigation and do minor repairs. The text was short and unsettling. "They're cutting." Mason's reply came within seconds. "Cutting what?" No answer. He tried calling. No answer. He got in the car, canceled 2 meetings on the road, and drove straight through the night. The next morning, pulling into his drive, he saw it. The orchard was gone. Not damaged, not vandalized. Gone. The ground was scraped flat in long mechanical swaths, the rich mulch replaced with raw, pale dirt. Here and there, Mason could still see the rings of the trees, their ghostly impressions like surgical scars in the earth. A new sidewalk path had been staked out, narrow orange flags marking future construction lines. In the center of what had been the orchard stood a freestanding vinyl sign, bright white with bold institutional blue lettering, Future Community Play Zone, bringing families together. It looked like something out of a glossy flyer. A pair of cartoon children were pictured, holding hands, their feet suspended over artificial turf. The sign wasn't vandalized or crooked. It was bolted into a fresh cement footing. For several minutes, Mason did nothing. He stood at the edge of the orchard and took in the silence. Not the tranquil kind he was used to, but a blank, airless vacuum. Then, without saying a word, he walked into the center of the flattened space, stood precisely where the main cluster of northern spy apples had once grown, and looked down. The soil was still damp, still stained with the pigment of sawdust and split bark. A few snapped limbs jutted out from the side like ribs. It was surgical, almost reverent in how completely it had been removed. He didn't scream. He didn't call anyone. He simply turned around, walked back to his house, and closed the door behind him. Inside, the living room felt alien. His house had always existed as a reflection of the land outside, low windows, deep shadows, natural textures. Now it was like a shell without a body. He poured a glass of water, sat on the edge of the kitchen table, and stared at nothing. His phone buzzed twice, Curtis finally replying with, "Didn't want to get in trouble. It was the board." Mason didn't reply. He didn't blame Curtis. The man was 68 and not looking for a fight. He'd seen what happened to neighbors who pushed back too hard. Fines, retroactive violations, accusations of code breaches that somehow kept appearing with increasing cost. Mason had always stayed out of it. Now they had come onto his land, altered it without consent, and planted an artificial future over something irreplaceable. He picked up his phone and opened a browser tab. Not social media, not news. Just a private database of rental equipment suppliers. He searched for two things: industrial-grade mulch grinders and hydraulic loaders. He didn't know yet what he was going to do, but he knew he would do it precisely, calmly, and with the full force of the earth beneath his feet. By midnight, the reservation was confirmed. By 2:45 a.m., the machines were parked at the edge of the site. At 3 a.m., sharp, the ground began to shake. The morning after the orchard was reduced to rubble, the hum of tires on gravel stirred Mason from a shallow, fractured sleep. He hadn't really gone to bed so much as he'd collapsed into the armchair in the corner of his office, surrounded by drafts, boundary maps, and correspondence, trying to untangle how this could have happened without his knowledge, without his permission, and without any formal notice beyond a cheery placard about bringing families together. He hadn't dreamt. His mind had been far too active for that. Instead, he stared into the faint glow of his desk lamp, trying to make sense of the impossible, a theft that no one would call a crime. He rose now and looked through the blinds. A black SUV was idling near the foot of his driveway. Two people stepped out, dressed in crisp blue polos with reflective tags clipped to their belts, the kind of uniform designed to look like authority without actually being it. Mason didn't bother greeting them. He stepped out onto the porch and waited. One of the men gave a polite wave, clipboard in hand, while the other stayed behind, arms crossed, surveying the property with the practiced posture of a bureaucratic enforcer. "Mr. Ridley," the man with the clipboard called out, voice overly bright, already too rehearsed. Mason didn't respond. He just stood there, arms relaxed at his sides, face unreadable. The man cleared his throat. "I'm with Community Enhancement and Development Services. We've been assigned to help transition your lot under Section 12, realignment of the—" "Stop," Mason said, not loudly, but with such precision that it left no room for continuing the script. "Speak like a human being, or leave." The man faltered, thrown off his tempo, then recovered with a more careful tone. "There's been a zoning shift. Your parcel is part of a newly designated open access initiative. The recreational development was approved 3 months ago. Mason tilted his head slightly. Without my consent. The realignment was voted on by the board, the man replied. It passed with a majority. That's not what I asked, Mason said. I didn't ask who voted. I asked who consented. I own this land. There was a moment's pause, during which the second man, still silent, still stone-faced, took a slow step forward, not threateningly, but as a subtle act of crowding. Mason saw it. He'd seen it 1,000 times in boardrooms and client sites when the speaker didn't know how to justify something. They compensated with posture. The parcel is part of the overlay, the first man continued. The community development plan has precedence under the new subdivision protocols. You would have received the initial packet via mail. I receive every piece of correspondence related to this property, Mason said. Every notice is logged, scanned, and retained. No such packet exists. Try again. This time the man hesitated more noticeably. Well, it's possible there was a miscommunication with the registry. No, not miscommunication. A decision was made, and it was hidden. Now it's been enacted. You cut down 42 fruit-bearing trees planted on protected soil. Do you know what kind of foundation layering that orchard had? The man shook his head cautiously. 30 years of compost, mulch, regenerative cultivation, and hand-fertilized microstrata, and you scraped it off like paint. There was a long pause. Neither of the visitors responded. They weren't qualified to. I'm not interested in your signage, Mason said at last. I want names. I'm afraid that kind of information. You're afraid? Yes, that's correct. He turned and walked back inside, closing the door without slamming it. Calm, precise, controlled. He didn't waste the rest of the morning. He compiled a folder. Satellite imagery of the property over time. Official plats, soil analysis reports, notarized statements from previous zoning assessments, and certified proof of delivery for every legal notice he had ever sent or received. The orchard wasn't just a garden. It was documented as a protected micro-ecosystem, flagged in several regional conservation networks, something Mason had ensured years ago as a precaution against casual development. By midday, he had emailed the full package to 2 people, his attorney, Marcus Ellery, and a contact at the county clerk's office who specialized in land disputes. He didn't add a cover letter. He didn't need to. The subject line simply read, Immediate review required, 4849 lot intrusion. Marcus called within the hour. Jesus, Mason, they really did it. They did. I thought you had that plot recorded under conservation partnership. Didn't that lock out unilateral revisions? On paper, yes. But they went around it. They didn't file revisions with the county. They must have done it through internal reclassification, probably pushed through in one of their board meetings with no actual public record. You're telling me they amended the plot classification without going through the recorder's office? That's exactly what I'm telling you. That's illegal. Mason paused. And yet there's a plastic sign in the middle of my orchard saying otherwise. Ellery exhaled hard into the receiver. I'll start digging. Don't make any moves. Not yet. We need leverage first. I'm not waiting for leverage, Mason said, but he didn't raise his voice. This wasn't a bureaucratic error. It was an intentional circumvention. They knew I was away. They knew I had long-standing soil work that wouldn't be visible from the curb. They timed it down to the week. Marcus knew better than to argue. Just, whatever you're planning, call me first. I already did. He hung up. That afternoon, Mason walked the perimeter of the lot, tracing each marker flag they'd inserted into the soil. He photographed everything, then slowly and methodically pulled every single flag from the ground and tossed them into a wheelbarrow. The grass was still damp from the morning dew, and as he moved it clung to his boots like a second skin. The land felt violated, not just used, but humiliated, as though someone had scrubbed its history clean in the name of convenience. The neighbors watched. Not directly. No one stood and stared openly, but curtains shifted, porches creaked. People paused just long enough while checking their mail. He saw them, noted them, logged them like entries in a ledger. But he didn't wave, didn't acknowledge, didn't explain. That night, after the sun dipped below the tree line and the shadows grew long and distorted, Mason returned to the house, downloaded the photographs, labeled the files, and printed them. He laid them across the dining room table like a forensic grid. Every severed stump, every groove left by bulldozer tracks, every boot print from the workers who had done the job in less than a day. Efficient, mechanized, thorough. The precision of the destruction was almost admirable, in a clinical sort of way. Then, calmly, Mason picked up the rental agreement for the industrial mulch grinder he had ordered days earlier and reviewed the details. Delivery window confirmed. Access path cleared. Fuel levels preloaded. There would be no signs, no warnings, no theatrical gestures or threats. There would be mulch. The machine arrived in the early evening, transported by a flatbed truck operated by a driver who didn't ask questions. Mason met him at the gate, signed the release forms without a word, and watched as the heavy equipment was maneuvered into place on the flattened section of land where the orchard had once stood. The grinder itself was a massive, self-propelled industrial unit, built less for aesthetics and more for clearing entire lots in hours. The kind of machine used to consume tree trunks, discarded fencing, utility poles, anything that couldn't be burned or hauled. It hummed faintly, even idle, as though aware of its purpose before being switched on. Mason thanked the driver curtly, refused the standard orientation, and spent the next hour walking the machine's perimeter, familiarizing himself with every switch, lever, and safety release. As the sun dropped low over the rooftops of the uniform houses beyond his fence line, casting elongated shadows across the scarred dirt, he walked back to the house, changed into old cargo pants and a long-sleeved canvas shirt, and returned with a headlamp, a fuel can, and heavy gloves. He didn't hurry. This wasn't revenge. It was removal. He waited until the neighborhood fell into its usual hush. The television flickers behind closed blinds, the idle hum of air conditioners, the muffled laughter of children who hadn't yet been ordered inside. It was important that everything seemed normal first, familiar, calm. Then, without ceremony, Mason started the machine. The noise was immediate and immense, a low, mechanical growl that vibrated the very soil beneath his boots. The grinder roared to life like something alive and long buried, displacing the quiet not like a siren, but like a rupture. Lights came on in windows. Porch doors opened. Mason didn't look toward them. He activated the loader arm and began feeding in the edges of what had been installed. The rubber safety turf, the synthetic corner fencing, the decorative plastic mushrooms bolted into the dirt for interactive play. One by one, they were swallowed by the steel jaws and reduced to shredded polymer mulch. The smell was acrid and faintly chemical. Burnt varnish, melted vinyl, artificial pigments turning into powder. At some point, someone shouted from the next property over. A man's voice, already irritated, "You're violating a noise ordinance." Mason didn't respond. The grinder drowned it out anyway. Another voice called, "You can't do that." Still, no reaction. Mason simply worked with methodical precision, reducing every bolt-secured, smiling structure into a heap of unrecognizable refuse. The decorative benches, splintered. The miniature rock wall, pulverized. The multicolored slide system with the ridiculous cartoon branding, devoured in one long mechanical shriek. The sign, the one that had started this whole farce with its corporate cheerfulness and asinine slogans, he left for last. It wobbled slightly in the wind as he approached, as if aware it was next. He detached it from its cement footing by hand, dragging it behind him like a corpse, then fed it in whole. It was gone in seconds. By the time he shut off the grinder, the sky was ink black and the street silent. No one approached. No one tried to stop him. Whether out of confusion, fear, or disbelief, the residents remained inside. The field where the orchard had once stood, and where the play structure had briefly replaced it, was now a wide, uneven terrain of dark mulch, faintly steaming in the night air. Mason secured the grinder, returned to the house, and showered without rush. He changed into clean clothes, made tea, and sat on the porch as if he'd merely finished trimming hedges. Around midnight, a pair of local officers pulled into the driveway. No sirens, no lights, just slow, deliberate presence. He watched them approach, their boots crunching on the gravel, their body language that practiced mix of authority and anticipation. "Mr. Ridley?" one of them asked. Mason nodded. "We've had reports of heavy machinery being operated past legal noise hours. We just want to confirm what happened." "I cleared an unauthorized structure from my property," Mason said. His tone was measured, calm. "Everything that was on my land is now in its proper place." The officer glanced past him toward the field. "You cleared it with a grinder?" "Yes. You know you might have violated municipal code. I filed no permits because no construction was authorized on my parcel. Therefore, no demolition required them either." The officers looked at each other, uncertain. This wasn't the usual confrontation. No shouting, no red face, no drunk denial. Just a man who had clearly done something irreversible and didn't flinch when questioned. "You mind if we take a walk around?" one asked. "Help yourself," Mason said, gesturing with his mug. "Stay on my side of the property line, though. The flags they installed weren't official. I've reset the true borders based on county records." The officers disappeared into the dark, flashlight beams tracing arcs across the mulch. Mason sipped his tea and waited. 10 minutes later, they returned. "Okay, we'll file a note about the complaint, but without evidence of property damage to another party. This is a civil matter for now," the first officer said. "That's correct. You may hear from the association." "I expect to." They hesitated, then left. It was, Mason reflected, the only proper outcome. He hadn't broken in. He hadn't crossed onto anyone else's property. He hadn't threatened anyone. He had simply taken back what had been wrongfully imposed upon him, using the same principles of efficiency and absence of ceremony his adversaries had employed. No emotion, just elimination. The next morning, Mason received 2 emails before he even finished his first coffee. The first was from Marcus. "Heard something happened last night. Please tell me it wasn't you, or at least that you did it cleanly." The second was a terse, vaguely scolding letter from the neighborhood committee stating that unauthorized destruction of shared property had occurred, that they were initiating review, and that Mason was expected to cease and desist any further actions that may impact communal harmony. Mason replied to Marcus first. It was clean. All of it. Then he opened a fresh document and began drafting a formal rebuttal. He attached images of his property boundaries, digital timestamps from the surveillance footage showing the installation crews entering his land, and copies of the county plat map confirming his exclusive ownership of the lot. He outlined, in exacting legal prose, how no formal transfer of development rights had occurred, how no public notice had been served, and how the board had violated multiple procedural steps by authorizing any construction, let alone demolition of a natural site, without proper notification or consent. When he sent the document, he included a simple subject line: "Reclamation complete." No threats, no ultimatums. Later that day, as he walked the property line with a measuring wheel and surveyor's string, he saw a group of residents clustered near the far side of the field. None of them approached. One of the children, he thought he recognized the boy from a nearby lot, started to step forward, then froze when his mother grabbed his arm. Mason didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge them. He simply kept walking, stringing the perimeter, anchoring markers at each corner, reclaiming not just the space but the silence that once defined it. He hadn't broken the law. He had redrawn a boundary. Now the question was, who would be brave enough to cross it? 3 days passed without further incident, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was curated, watched, deliberate. Mason could feel the shift in air pressure whenever he stepped outside, the same kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Neighbors no longer lingered on their porches. Instead, they peered through windows that darkened the moment he looked back. The association board, predictably, hadn't responded to his legal packet with anything of substance. Only a short follow-up stating they had referred the matter to council. That meant stall tactics. That meant behind-the-scenes scrambling, internal emails, and the quiet panic of a group realizing they had underestimated the wrong man. Mason didn't wait. He contacted Marcus again and gave him the go-ahead to begin the discovery process. If they wanted to treat this like a legal gray zone, he'd flood them in white-hot clarity. But something unexpected happened. Late one afternoon, a letter appeared. Not in the mailbox, not via email, but tucked beneath the front door in a plain white envelope with no markings. Inside was a single page, handwritten in unremarkable block letters. Not everyone voted for it. Ask Harold in Lot 22. He's got the minutes. They shut him down when he objected. That was it. No name. No return address. Just a thin slip of caution dropped into his otherwise airtight world. Mason didn't jump on it right away. He placed the note in his desk drawer, sat back, and thought. If it was real, and if someone had indeed objected to the orchard demolition internally, then the board's so-called majority vote hadn't been unanimous, and, more importantly, they had suppressed a record of dissent. That was leverage. Not in the grand sense of legal exposure, but socially. In a place like this, where civility was a currency and the illusion of consensus mattered more than fact, proof that the board steamrolled a fellow homeowner could split the unity they relied on to operate without resistance. 2 evenings later, Mason left the house on foot and made his way down the lane toward Lot 22. It was dusk, and the sky was smeared in burnt orange. The Ridley name still carried a certain distance, neutral but unmistakable. So when Harold Bennett opened the door, he didn't look surprised to see Mason. If anything, he looked resigned. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Harold said. The man was in his 70s, balding, with a hawk's build and the permanent frown of someone who read everything twice. "I got a note," Mason said. "Said you objected." Harold hesitated, then stepped aside. "You better come in." The interior of the house was old, not in style but in atmosphere. Books stacked in every corner, framed black-and-white photos of landscapes and machinery lining the hallway, and the low scent of pipe tobacco that hadn't been lit in a long time. Mason followed Harold into the den, where a large wooden desk sat covered in paper, bound files, and envelopes with official seals. No computers, just records. Real ones. "I told them not to do it," Harold said without prompting. "Told them the orchard was part of the environmental registry. Told them it was your property and that any development would be legally challengeable. You know what they did?" He didn't wait for Mason to answer. "They removed me from the vote, said I had conflict of interest because I had a surveyor contract with the previous landowner, claimed it could influence my objectivity. I haven't worked in 10 years. "Do you have the minutes?" Mason asked. Harold reached under the desk and pulled out a folder labeled March 14th. He opened it, leafed through, and handed Mason 3 pages. Typed, time-stamped, notarized. Mason scanned quickly. There it was, in paragraph 6, a motion raised by Harold to delay the vote until legal review. A second motion, rejected on grounds of procedural redundancy. Then the vote, 6 in favor, 1 abstention, 1 recused. Harold's name, redacted. They used a procedural trick, Harold said. Technically, they didn't need it to be unanimous, but they wanted it to look that way. They knew what they were doing. Mason nodded once. Can I copy these? Take them. I've got originals. Just don't let them tell you this was a mistake. It was strategic. You were targeted. Why? Harold exhaled through his nose. Because they thought you'd ignore it like the others. Keep it quiet. Pay a lawyer, maybe. But never act. He stood, not offering more, and Mason didn't press. He left quietly, the folder under his arm, and walked the long way back around the neighborhood. The path curved along the outer edge of the development, past the retention pond and the maintenance shed, places most homeowners forgot existed. That night, he didn't sleep. He cataloged the documents, scanned them, backed them up 3 times, and sent one copy to Marcus with the subject line, Board, dissent, confirmed. Non-unanimous. 1 removal. The response came back in under 10 minutes. We've got them now. By morning, the dynamic had shifted. The board sent an email blast to all residents attempting to downplay the demolition as a necessary recalibration of recreational assets. But word had already spread. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to Mason in months were now circling their conversations around the property line, tentative, careful, trying to extract a signal. Some approached with veiled curiosity, others with half apologies disguised as concerns. One man jogged past Mason's house 3 times in a row, not breaking pace but clearly slowing each time as if expecting an ambush. No one mentioned Harold, but they didn't have to. The silence said enough. Their solidarity had cracks now. Mason had found a wedge. The following weekend, Mason attended a community meeting for the first time in 4 years. He arrived 15 minutes early, took a seat near the front, and said nothing. When the board members entered, they froze momentarily, not in fear, but in uncertainty, like performers who've forgotten their lines in the presence of someone who wrote the script. When they opened the floor to general commentary, Mason stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He read aloud the section of the meeting minutes where Harold's motion was overruled. He read it calmly, clearly, and then laid the papers on the table in front of the chairwoman. She looked down at them, then up at him, and said nothing. Mason turned to the room and said, "These are the actual records. This was not a mistake. It was a calculated removal. And if they can do it to one of their own, they can do it to anyone." Then he walked out. He didn't stay for discussion. He didn't need to. For 2 days after the meeting, nothing happened on the surface, but Mason knew better than to assume silence was surrender. The moment he laid Harold's documents in front of the chairwoman, the dynamic had shifted from quietly antagonistic to openly adversarial. He could feel it in the way certain neighbors began giving him longer looks, in how the weekly newsletter suddenly omitted the usual platitudes about community spirit, in how the landscaping crew, previously ubiquitous, stopped working on his side of the development altogether. It wasn't just passive resistance anymore. It was surgical isolation. Then, just before dawn on the 3rd day, a notice was taped to his door. Not mailed, not emailed. Taped, direct contact, deliberate placement, centered perfectly at eye level like a badge of enforcement. The font was institutional, the language intentionally vague but laced with bureaucratic threat. It stated that, pending review of property use violations, his land had been flagged for non-compliant restoration, citing neighborhood guidelines concerning authorized communal land conversion. It referenced no legal statutes, no municipal directives, no binding contracts, only internal language that sounded official enough to frighten those who didn't know better. Mason read it twice, then carefully removed the tape and filed the paper away without a word. He wasn't surprised. It was the next move in a chess game he'd seen before. When power couldn't defeat fact, it shifted to perception. If they couldn't undo what he'd proven, they'd discredit the legitimacy of his response. They would call him unstable, a danger to community cohesion. They'd whisper phrases like mental unwellness or violent tendencies and let paranoia do the rest. And then came Karen. She had never spoken to him before the orchard was raised. She lived 4 doors down in one of the newer houses. Larger footprint, larger mortgage, stainless steel mailbox with a smart lock system that made a faint beep whenever it opened. The kind of house designed to impress people who didn't have to live in it. Her yard was immaculate in a way that bordered on obsessive. Topiary spirals flanked the entrance, and every week a different wreath appeared on the door. Halloween, Easter, even National Pet Day. But what set Karen apart wasn't the decor. It was the way she performed her ownership. Every interaction was a transaction in which she was owed compliance, deference, and immediate accommodation. She knocked just before noon, standing perfectly upright with a white folder pressed to her chest and the polite smile of someone who intended to ruin your afternoon under the guise of conversation. Mason answered only because he was already in the front room and tired of pretending not to be home. "Hi, Mason," she began as if they were old acquaintances. "I thought we should talk, as neighbors." He didn't invite her in. He didn't ask what she wanted. He simply waited. She continued without pause. "There's some concern about the way things have been progressing. A few of us think you may be taking things personally, and it's affecting the children. They miss the play space. It's unfortunate what happened, but maybe there's a way to move forward without further drama." Mason stared at her, letting the silence expand just enough to force discomfort. "Did you help vote on the removal of my orchard?" Karen blinked. "That's not really the point anymore." "It's exactly the point." Her smile thinned. "Listen, I know you feel strongly about the trees, but let's be honest, most of them weren't even producing anymore. It wasn't like a working farm. That orchard was a designed biome. Every tree had purpose, but you didn't ask. You assumed." "I didn't assume anything," she said, stepping slightly closer. "I followed guidance. We all did. You weren't involved. You didn't make your voice heard. I made my boundaries clear. You crossed them." Karen's expression changed, just slightly. The veneer of calm slipped to reveal the edge beneath. "You know, it's funny. A lot of people are starting to wonder what else you're hiding back there. What you're doing with all that mulch. There's talk about property values, safety." "There's always talk," Mason said, "and it always sounds like a threat." Karen laughed, not kindly. "No one's threatening you. But if things keep escalating, someone might get nervous enough to call the city, or the fire department, or code enforcement. Things can spiral fast when people feel unsafe." Mason didn't react. He simply stepped back and began to close the door. "You've had your say. You won't get another chance." He shut it firmly, locking it with an audible click, not out of fear but punctuation. By that evening, the narrative had shifted again. Posts began appearing in the neighborhood forum, anonymous but unmistakably orchestrated. Phrases like increasingly erratic behavior, hostile toward residents, and concerning noise at night were seeded into threads about landscaping, community safety, and even school carpool arrangements. The implication was never direct but always strategic. Mason was becoming a problem. Then came the complaint filed with the county zoning office. It accused him of unauthorized land modifications, unsafe equipment storage, and improper disposal of construction debris. The timing was deliberate. Late Friday afternoon, ensuring that the weekend would pass without resolution, letting the idea fester in the minds of those who didn't care about facts, only impressions. But Mason had anticipated that, too. He had kept meticulous records, time-stamped photographs, GPS-stamped survey data, and video documentation of every modification he made, each one cross-referenced against county allowances for single property owner rights under grandfathered zoning. Designations. When the county officer finally visited, he expected hostility and was instead greeted with a full binder and a quiet man who simply said, "You'll want to start on page 4." The officer left without issuing a citation, but the damage had been done. The accusation was out there, and accusations rarely needed to be proven to be believed. The final stroke came when his irrigation system was sabotaged. It happened overnight. One of the main lines was cut, not cleanly, but with deliberate malice, flooding a portion of the lower lot and ruining several seed beds Mason had been preparing for seasonal replanting. He discovered it the next morning, boots sinking into soft, drowned soil, the air heavy with the smell of rot and chlorinated stagnation. There was no note, no graffiti, just silent destruction. Mason stood for a long moment at the edge of the damage, breathing through his teeth, fists clenched in his pockets. This was no longer politics, no longer zoning debates or passive-aggressive policies. This was personal now. Sabotage designed not to claim land, but to humiliate, to break rhythm, to unravel the careful order he had maintained. He went inside, changed clothes, and made a single phone call. To Marcus. "File the suit," Mason said, voice flat. "All of it?" Marcus asked. "All of it. Property destruction, procedural fraud, and retaliatory harassment. And make sure Karen's name is on it." "You have proof she's involved?" "I have enough." He hung up. That afternoon, a formal lawsuit was served to 4 individuals on the board, including the chairwoman, and to Karen personally. Within hours, the neighborhood forum went dark. Administered by the board, it was abruptly taken offline for maintenance. That same evening, a process server stood at Karen's door, delivering the envelope while neighbors peeked through blinds. She didn't open the door. Mason didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He spent the rest of the day repairing his irrigation system, alone, methodically, restoring what had been broken not because of negligence, but because someone else believed he wouldn't have the strength to fix it. He was tired, the kind of tired that went deeper than muscles or bone. But there was something underneath it now, something more solid than rage. Resolve. He knew what came next. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning to show its real shape. The hearing wasn't held in some grand courtroom or stately hall, but in a low-slung municipal annex building that smelled of old carpet and recycled paper, a place designed to process disputes quickly and quietly, away from public attention. That suited Mason perfectly. He wasn't interested in spectacle. He wanted the record. He wanted the undeniable, permanent presence of truth on paper, signed by officials who couldn't ignore him the way the board had. His lawyer, Marcus, met him at the entrance, carrying 2 leather-bound portfolios and wearing a look of contained purpose. "They'll try to pivot," he said without preamble. "Expect emotion, victim language, maybe even appeals to community cohesion. Stick to fact. We've got everything we need." Mason didn't reply. He just nodded once, stepped through the security scanner, and walked into the chamber where, for the first time, the board would be forced to face him under oath. The members were already seated at the opposing table, each with their own counsel, trying and failing to present a unified posture. The chairwoman looked pale, her jaw clenched, eyes fixed ahead. Karen sat at the far end of the row, arms folded, her mouth pressed into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her lawyer, a younger man with too much cologne and not enough paper, was whispering something urgently in her ear. She didn't look at Mason. She didn't need to. Her presence was performance. She was playing the part of the falsely accused, the misunderstood volunteer who only wanted a better community. Mason saw through it instantly. The proceedings began with standard introductions, then moved into opening statements. Marcus kept his tone dry and surgical. He outlined the sequence of events with brutal efficiency: the unauthorized demolition of a private, legally distinct orchard, the installation of a non-approved recreational structure, the manipulation of internal board procedures to silence, dissenting votes, the retaliatory efforts to discredit the property owner, and finally, the sabotage of irrigation systems following a failed attempt to legally intimidate. He referenced photographic evidence, recorded timestamps, sworn declarations from third parties, and Harold's notarized minutes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply laid the case down, line by line, until it became a structure too clean to be dismissed. The opposing counsel responded with a mixture of manufactured concern and vague accusations. They attempted to frame Mason as hostile, emotionally volatile, resistant to cooperative dialogue. They referenced community unease, public perception, and a breakdown in shared values. Karen's lawyer, in particular, leaned hard into the idea of emotional climate, suggesting that Mason's actions, though technically within his rights, had created an atmosphere of fear. When it came time to speak directly, Karen herself addressed the panel. She talked about the children, about the need for open space, about how she had merely supported what the board had deemed best for everyone, and how she had become the unfortunate focus of misplaced resentment. Mason remained motionless throughout, his hands folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. When the time came, he rose, walked to the designated floor mark, and gave his statement. He didn't attack. He didn't even mention names. He described the history of the orchard, its layout, its soil structure, its function, not as a food source but as a heritage site, a living architectural design passed down through family. He spoke about watching it be destroyed without warning, about returning home to find it scraped bare by machines he didn't hire, installed with structures he never authorized. He recounted the steps he took, not revenge, but reclamation. He described being harassed, framed, and accused by those who had never spoken to him before the trees fell. Then he handed over the last document. It was a forensic soil analysis. It showed trace damage to the surrounding properties from leaching synthetic rubber compounds, residue from the melted play structure materials that had seeped into the ground during the demolition. The mulch, it turned out, had done more than erase a playground. It had revealed contamination. Mason's cleanup had prevented it from spreading. That changed the tone in the room. The panel recessed for deliberation, and Mason stepped outside into the narrow alley beside the building, where the air was warm and still. Marquis joined him a moment later, sipping coffee from a paper cup and shaking his head slightly. She tried to play public sympathy. You played the soil. Guess which one the board respects more. When the verdict came, it was both immediate and surgical. The board was found in procedural violation for enacting land use decisions without full disclosure and for removing private ecological installations without permit. Karen's direct involvement was categorized as non-authoritative but materially contributory, meaning she wasn't legally liable in full, but her name would be attached to the court's findings for public record. Mason was granted formal restoration rights, compensatory damages for ecological loss, and the full cost of legal and land survey expenses. The final clause, though, was the real win. A standing injunction barring any further communal development decisions involving his property for a period of 20 years, unless approved by municipal authority, not the board. Mason didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just signed the confirmation paperwork, thanked Marcus quietly, and walked out of the annex with the calm of someone who had already buried what needed burying. Karen stood in the parking lot, arms folded, sunglasses covering her expression. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Mason passed her without a glance. When he returned home, he walked the perimeter of his lot, not with urgency but with ritual. The mulch had long settled into the soil, enriched now with new compost and native grass seeds. There were no fences, no cameras, no warning signs. Just space. His by right and by record. And that night, for the first time in months, he slept. It wasn't over, not in the way most people imagine stories ending, but it was resolved. Mason didn't plant new trees right away. He didn't rebuild the orchard or try to recreate what had been lost. He let the land breathe. The mulch gradually darkened and integrated with the soil. Wild growth began to appear along the edges. Native grasses, self-seeded herbs from the wind, small volunteers from the surviving root systems of trees that hadn't been entirely destroyed. The land wasn't a monument to victory. It was a scar that healed on its own terms, without ceremony or landscaping plans. Mason tended it the way you'd tend a recovering animal, observing more than interfering, guiding only when necessary. The board stopped sending notices. The once frequent emails from neighborhood subcommittees and wellness outreach initiatives ceased entirely. Karen's house was still 4 doors down, but her public presence dwindled into near invisibility. Her wreaths became sporadic, her yard slightly less obsessive, her carefully maintained persona cracking in small but telling ways. The lawsuit hadn't ruined her, but it had marked her. In a neighborhood obsessed with perception, that was often more lasting than legal consequence. Mason didn't speak to her. He didn't speak to most of them. He never returned to the community meetings. There was no need. His land was his again, not just in title, but in reality. The unspoken message had taken root deeper than the orchard ever had. Not all homeowners could be pressured into submission. He occasionally received quiet nods from neighbors when he passed, especially from the older ones. Harold visited once more, delivering a sealed envelope with nothing more than a single note inside. Good land doesn't forget who stands for it. Mason burned the paper, not out of disrespect, but to return it to the ground. He kept his routines: early mornings, soil checks, late walks around the perimeter in the hours before dawn, when the neighborhood still slept and the sky held the quiet weight of potential. There was no vindication, no triumph, just stillness, not absence, but presence reclaimed. Every time he knelt to test moisture levels or ran a line for irrigation or merely stood still with his hand resting on the earth, he remembered what it had felt like when that space had been flattened without warning, erased under the guise of communal improvement. He remembered the sound of rubber turf shredding through industrial teeth, the look of blank faces pretending it was all just policy, and he remembered what it took to face it down. Not with outrage, not with spectacle, but with control, with discipline, with precision. He hadn't saved an orchard. That was never the point. He'd reclaimed the boundary between ownership and permission, between land and illusion, between quiet men and loud systems. And in